Hello, I'm Lindsay Foyle and I'm here to talk about The Pots, how a comic strip which started out as You and Me in 1920 became The Pots and was the oldest comic strip in Australian newspapers at the time. While comics played a big part in the newspaper wars in New York in the 1890s, they didn't take off in Australian newspapers. For some reason or other, editors just didn't warm to them. There were two newspapers, Melbourne Punch and the Bulletin, which ran a lot of cartoons, and they ran things which we would recognise as comics, but they didn't run the following week, and they didn't have a title, and they didn't have constant characters, so they were just really little stories illustrated. That changed with the arrival of Smith's Weekly in 1919. It was a broadsheet newspaper. It was financed by Joynton Smith, who had been Lord Mayor of Sydney, who was very wealthy, and he had Claude Mackay as the editor and Robert Clyde Packer as the managing editor. And the three of them were all known for being able to smell money from a long distance. When they first started to develop the newspaper, they found Archibald, who had been the founding editor of the Bulletin, on their doorstep, wanting to come in and help them compete with the Bulletin, which he thought was old and worn out at the time. So the first thing they did was employ Cess Hart as a cartoonist. He'd been in World War One, had some success as a cartoonist, but had been largely struggling. Then they came across a cartoonist in Perth called Stan Cross. He was about 30 years old and been freelancing in Perth, and they sent him a cable and asked him if he'd like to join Smith's Weekly, and if he did, what would he like? And he sent a response back saying he would be happy to join, but he wanted to be paid £2 10 shillings a week, and he wanted 2 tickets from Perth to Sydney. Mackay thought that was a little bit underdone, so he sent him back a request to come and join the paper at £5 a week and with a 5-year contract. This was something Stan Cross couldn't knock back. Before he arrived in Sydney, Alex Sass arrived. He was a cartoonist who'd worked in Melbourne and had taught Stan Cross how to draw at one point. Had a lot of experience on newspapers, particularly ones on crappy newsprint and rotary presses, which were just coming into the fashion. Stan Cross arrived in Sydney about 3 weeks after the paper was first launched, and to everybody's horror, could only draw with wash drawings. This wasn't reproducible in the newspaper, so Sass had to teach Stan how to draw with a pen in lines. Once that was conquered, Stan started to draw cartoons for the paper, and he'd been doing that for about a year when Errol Knox, one of the journalists there, said the paper should start comic strips. Stan developed one which was published in the paper called You and Me. And it was about 2 men, Whale's Teeth and Mr. Pot, P-O-T, arguing about politics. The arguments got fairly intense, and while some readers enjoyed them, others thought everything was a bit heavy-handed. So after the strip had been running for about 3 months, it was softened a little bit with the introduction of Mrs. Pot. However, the Pot's name was then changed to a double T instead of a single T. And the comic developed into a squabble between a husband and wife. And it moved along in that vein, with Whale's Teeth joining in every now and again, and just became a domestic argument. Comic ran in the paper till 1939, when Stan Cross resigned. He was at the time the art director of the paper and the highest paid person there. But when he put in for his holidays, he was told he didn't have any, because the paper had recently been taken over by new owners and they didn't have holidays transferred. Cross was upset and he contacted Keith Murdoch in Melbourne, who was running the Herald Weekly Times, and asked him if he was interested in Stan working for that paper. Keith Murdoch said yes, said Stan could work in Sydney while working for the Melbourne paper, and Stan flounced off and started a new comic which became Wally and the Major. Jimmy Russell was given the job of art director on Smith's and the responsibility of continuing You and Me. And in January 1949, his first contribution was published, but he changed the name to Mr. and Mrs. Pott and made it softer and a more gentle series of adventures, and became a domestic discussion rather than so much arguments. Jimmy also introduced 2 children, grown-up children, and 2 grandchildren to the strip, and that continued for another decade. In 1950, Jimmy Russell had a falling out with the editors at Smith's, because he thought that the paper had become sycophantic to the Menzies government. And when he complained, he was told to butt out and mind his own business. He was just a cartoonist and to behave like one. So he contacted Keith Murdoch and told him he was unhappy, and Murdoch agreed for him to go and join the paper too. Soon after, the Smith's Weekly folded. The building was worth more than the paper, and so the new owners wanted the real estate. The copyright for Smith's went to John Fairfax and Sons, and everybody was sacked. Jimmy Russell sat down to draw a new comic, which was along similar lines to the Potts. But as he was doing that, Keith Murdoch contacted Fairfax and said, would they be willing to give up copyright on the comic and let Jimmy draw it again, or continue drawing it, and then the Sydney Morning Herald could run the strip free for a couple of years. It was not a problem for Fairfax because they got something for nothing, and Jimmy was able to continue the strip. It started in the Herald Weekly Times, the Herald Weekly Times owned Sun News Pictorial, and it had another name change, this time to the Potts, and it continued for some time, syndicated throughout Australia, and after a few years in America too, with Arthur Lefebvre running the syndication. Lefebvre had also been syndicating Ginger Meggs and took on the Potts because he had few things to offer newspapers when going and selling, and he thought the Potts would be handy to have in the bag. It wasn't a strip that he liked, and he is on record of having said that he only did it because it was something he had for nothing and could offer it for very little. It was taken up by about 35 newspapers in America, and that was about the extent of it. Jimmy had been drawing the strip for a while when the Sunday Sun and the Sunday Herald merged to form the Sun Herald, and they wanted a new comic, so the Potts was added as a Sunday strip, so Jimmy was then working 7 days a week. He continued to do that for some time, but when he reached the age of 65, the Herald Weekly Times told him he had to retire because they had a compulsory retirement age. Jimmy was not happy and asked if he could continue, and because there was nobody else willing to take the strip on, and because it was popular and they couldn't find anybody else, they agreed that he could have a 12-month extension. At the end of that 12 months, he was again told he had to retire. And again, he said he still liked drawing the strip. He would like to do it continuously. And unless the Herald Weekly Times could find someone to take it over, he wanted to do it. As there was nobody else around who wanted to draw the strip, Jimmy was allowed to do it freelance. So he retired and was able to draw the pots in retirement the same way as he'd been doing in Sydney for the previous 20 years. Jimmy was also involved in travel business, and he was ran the travel arrangements for the Sydney or for the Australian Olympic squad, and was in Tokyo when Dawn Fraser stole the flag. And in fact, she'd actually left from Jimmy's room to go and steal the flag. Jimmy also went to America 2 or 3 times a year to try and interest people in the pots, and also so he could have a chance to catch up with his friends there where he liked to drink and tell tall tales to. It was an interesting exercise to see him on the flights, because he would open up the little table in the plane and drag out a sheet of paper, which was about A3 size, and sketch out a Potts comic strip. He'd then get out a bottle of ink and a pen and ink it in. And the flight attendants would have to put food and coffee around his drawings, which was not easy considering the drawing was much bigger than the table. When he got back to Sydney, he'd present the comic strip to the Sydney Morning Herald and say to them, there it is. They would have to try and make this freehand drawing fit into the regular size of the comic strip, which was no easy job. And they said they spent more time on making his strip fit the space available than they did with all the other strips they were running combined. Not a lot of fun. Jimmy was no, how do you put it? He was not shy in telling people that he took gags from friends and neighbours and things, and he at one point had to introduce Uncle Dick to soften the strip because it got too domestically squabbled. His wife said of Uncle Dick that it was more like him than he was of himself, and Jimmy said that he didn't know if Uncle Dick had become more like him or he'd become more like Uncle Dick. But Uncle Dick became the centre of the strip for quite some time. And in fact, in the 1990s, the comic strip was syndicated in America as Uncle Dick and not the Potts. Jimmy also didn't shy away from reusing a gag. He would redraw it and rewrite the strip, but it was the same gag. And he would use this. He would rerun the same thing every 2 or 3 years, with the thinking behind it that people will have forgotten that he'd done it before, and he was probably right because nobody ever complained. Jimmy worked on the Potts for over 60 years, and at the time he died, held the record for the longest running art, or the artist who had drawn the one strip for the longest in comic history, which wasn't bad. And when he died in 2001, nobody wanted to take the strip on, and it just came to an end. And that's the end of the Potts. Right. How do we turn this off?
You stopped recording it, didn't you?
No, it's still going.